Welcome, listener, to a place of stories. Stories of the magic and the mundane, of how these differ and are the same. Stories with sterling secrets and lying lore. In these, the Tales of Grimoire. Book 1. The Lost God. Chapter 1. The Road to Nowhere. Kimiko knew both exactly where she had come from and exactly where she longed to be. Despite the unbroken road linking the two, she had no idea exactly where she was. Weeks of forced marching were taking their toll. Days of starvation were taking their toll. Hours in the harsh, unbroken sunlight without water were taking their toll. Kimiko uttered a prayer to the wind spirits. She was desperate for relief. She could feel the cool spring breeze playing across her skin, absolving her of her torment, filling her nose with the sense of new beginnings and hope. The wind was a fantasy. The spirits were deaf to her pleas. It was quiet in the highlands today. Kimiko missed the deafening commotion of the city and the erratic music of the forest. The only sounds that joined her now were the soft taps of her boots on the cobbles and the mocking silence of the air. Even the voices were quiet for now. The faces, too, had seemingly abandoned her. Perhaps she had died, and this was the long walk. Kimiko was roused suddenly from these musings when she heard it. Someone was speaking. Kimiko whipped around toward the road behind her. Barren mountainside to the south, rolling grassland to the north. No one on the road. Kimiko held her breath. She listened intently, but the sound was gone. She resumed her original course. She eyed the crags ahead suspiciously. Less than a mile off, the road passed between a steep mountainside and a pile of fallen boulders. She reached behind her back and loosened her sword in its scabbard. Assess, understand, anticipate, plan, but never worry before a battle. Kimiko moved slowly, listening carefully for the sound. It never came. Kimiko was only a few meters away from the boulders when two men leapt from behind them, brandishing swords. Kimiko's pulse began to race. Her heartbeat rang in her ears. She could feel bile rising in her throat. She reached back to withdraw her blade. She fumbled with the hilt, and the draw was clumsy. She threw herself off balance as she slid the weapon from the guide. Before she knew it, she was trying desperately to catch herself as she stumbled off the road entirely. The next thing she knew, she was tumbling down the hill. She hit the bottom hard. The taste of blood filled her mouth. She looked up to see her assailants rushing down the hill. She cast around desperately for her sword. Seeing it nearby, she awkwardly leapt from her crouch to grab a hold of the hilt. She was raising the blade as the first man reached the bottom. He raised his sword above his head and brought it down in a hard slash. Kimiko sidestepped the cut. She allowed her training to take hold as she swung her own blade up. She unleashed all of the energy she could muster as she brought it down. The edge entered between his shoulder and neck. With no armor to slow it down, the blade continued until it severed the arm cleanly. Kimiko did not stop to watch what followed. The second man was upon her. She brought her blade up to parry his initial slash. She caught it awkwardly and had to spin off to avoid being forced to the ground. He moved quickly to capitalize on this opening and made a thrust that Kimiko could feel through her armor. Kimiko spun and took a defensive stance. She was already breathing heavily. The man was wearing full plate around his chest. Everything else looked to be covered in scrap armor. A solid cut anywhere but the chest should deal a bad wound. Unfortunately, he did not look as tired as Kimiko was. She made her decision. She feinted right and then began sprinting back up the hill to her left. After a beat, she could hear the man giving pursuit. She pushed herself as hard as she could. She had to reach the road and try to run for it. She dashed up onto the road and banked toward the east. A sword swung down mere centimeters in front of her face. Kimiko recoiled and resumed her defensive stance as the man joined her on the road. He advanced slowly. Kimiko appreciated the opportunity to consider her options. He was clearly faster. He was clearly more experienced. Her armor could survive at least a few blows from his blade, though. Could it withstand enough for her to rush in and land a hit? A formless shadow appeared on the horizon. Another traveler, perhaps? A potential ally, if she could hold out long enough for them to arrive? Kimiko was interrupted by the return of the sword. The man pressed forward, lunging with the tip of his blade. She backed down the road, attempting to parry his attacks with her unwieldy Zweihander. After a few yards, she saw her opening. The man tripped in a gap between two cobbles. Without thinking, Kimiko thrust her sword forward. Blood began flowing down his neck as he slid from the blade and onto the ground. Kimiko breathed a sigh of relief, followed by a sharp inhalation. A third man was sprinting toward her. Kimiko rushed forward to meet him, eager to do battle away from the lifeless bandit in the road. She raised her blade to parry his first downward blow. She was nearly knocked off her feet. The second was similarly strong. She was in no mood to experience the third. Kimiko stepped sideways to avoid the swing. Her ankle twisted as her foot collided with the ground lower than she expected. She was going downhill again. Kimiko recovered from the awkward footing and rolled her shoulder forward to avoid the backswing. She drew a deep breath. The pain it caused was nothing short of exquisite. She was tiring. The adrenaline was waning. She thought back to the shadow on the horizon. She desperately wished this traveler could aid her, but she knew they must be far off. She could not count on a rescue. Kimiko righted herself and firmed her grip on the greatsword. She tightened the muscles in her arms as she drew the blade up over her shoulder, preparing for a downward slash. Before her, the sweat-covered behemoth of a man was still reeling backwards from the force of his own return swing. Kimiko threw all of her strength into her swing. Her arms exploded in agony as she released what energy she could. All of her rage was channeled into this blow. Kimiko's sword was cleaving the air so cleanly she swore she could hear it split. It inched agonizingly closer to the man as Kimiko watched in slow motion. The man watched it too. As Kimiko's sword drove downward, the man's shield rose to meet it. The shield was a sturdy thing of wood and boiled leather, made for catching blades. Kimiko let the blade collide with the shield. She was too tired to halt herself, the momentum of the blade too great for her to correct her mistake. The blade caught the shield full on and stuck in the wood. The hilt flew out of her grasp as the shield and its owner were flung backwards. Stand your ground, Kimiko. Kimiko could no longer stand. She continued on in the direction her weapon had been going. Her arms hit the ground, followed by her face. Kimiko sank into the dry grass. It cut as she slid into it, but the insult was lost to her utter exhaustion. Never surrender, Kimiko. Kimiko did not lift her head, could not lift her head. 2 down. She had killed 2 of her attackers. It was her first real battle, and she had killed 2 of them. No one could fault her. She had fought bravely, and her attackers had paid dearly. Kimi? The faces flashed in her mind's eye. She could see all of them. She could not care, though. The faces were distant now. Kimiko allowed her gaze, half obscured as it was by the blades of grass, to fall on the man once more. He looked even more beastly from this angle. The man had recovered and was advancing. Kimiko could see everything playing out, painfully slow. He took 1 step, and then another. We love you, Kimmy. The man took another step. Another. Another. The man lifted his sword. Kimiko stared at it. It was strangely beautiful, glinting in the sunlight, perfectly clean, absurdly smooth. It shone wonderfully. I tried. I cannot. The man brought the sword down. It would no longer shine. Small pools of red had appeared along its surface. Kimiko focused her gaze on the man. Time sped up as she realized an arrow now sprouted from his neck. She stared at the horrid, sinking realization of his face as he died. The sword spun away from his grasp, and he fell choking to the ground, facing her. Kimiko stared into his eyes as they pleaded with her. She stared into his eyes as their color began to drain. She stared into his eyes as the soul fled them. Kimiko then sobbed. Kimiko sobbed for several minutes, for an eternity. Kimiko rolled onto her back and closed her eyes. She could still see all of it. She rolled onto her belly and pushed herself up. She lost what little was in her stomach, but she was still not clean. She was still filled with the awful. She collapsed and began gibbering. She cried her sisters' names. She cried her parents' names, the names of everyone she had ever known. As she shouted her angry prayer, she could see their faces again. Every one of them, and the 2 of them. The 2 faces she did not know. After a fashion, she righted herself and sat cross-legged on the uneven ground to properly address these 2 new faces. You okay? The swarthy face inquired. Kimiko was not okay. Yeah. Are you hurt? The sun-averse face inquired. I do not think I am bleeding. It occurred to Kimiko that these two faces might know about the arrow. You saved me? The swarthy face scrunched up before answering, "Yeah, I guess." "Thanks." "No problem. I'm Dor. This is Kyle," the swarthy face offered. A hand appeared below the sun-averse face and waved at the word Kyle. "Kimiko." Dor pulled a confused face. "How's that?" "Sorry, my name is Kimiko." The three spent a beat in thoughtful silence before the question occurred to Kimiko. She turned it around several times before she was brave enough to ask it. "Why him?" Kyle raised an eyebrow. "Sorry? Why did you shoot him?" "There were two of us here. You shot him. Why?" "We saw a fight break out, too far away to tell what was going on. One bloke went down as we walked, so we started running. We got a bit closer, you took out the other one. Then the third bloke rushed at you. We got closer and you went down. We saw the big bloke start to raise his sword and..." Kyle trailed off. "And I thought to myself, just like a bandit to keep going after they're down. So I shot him," Dor finished with a smirk. Kimiko absorbed the story quietly. They had their reasons. There were real, tangible reasons that a man had been shot. She could think of no reason 3 men were dead. She became acutely aware of the sweat covering her body. From head to toe, she was covered in a thin film of vile salt. Every slight movement felt sticky and restricted. The stench would have overwhelmed her were it not for the disgust she already felt. She was hungry, too. She had not eaten this day, and indeed had run short of rations 2 days past. Game was in short supply in these hills, for one without a bow. Foraging was light as well here in the highlands. Her stomach was in dull agony. Mostly, though, Kimiko was tired. Not only from her walk this day and those of the past weeks, but from lack of sleep as well. Kimiko stared off into the hills. She sat for an eternity or two before a hand appeared. Kimiko focused on this unwelcome intruder. Upon further inspection, she saw the hand was attached to an arm. That arm was attached to Kyle. This concludes today's story. Tales of Grimoire is written, produced, and edited by Maxwell McHugh. Narration by Maxwell McHugh. Original score by Maxwell McHugh.